Next up is our plenary session. We are pleased to welcome Reece Harding of Young Anderson, Mayor Karen Elliott, and CEO Linda Glenday from the District of Squamish. In the plenary workshop organized by the Local Government Management Association, LGMA, entitled The New Normal, How to Build Constructive Council-Board Relationships. This session will have 4 parts. Part 1 is a live poll. To respond to a live poll, please click on the poll section located on the right-hand side of your screen. Select your answer and click Submit to share your response. It might take a while for the poll to populate. Once the poll closes, the results will appear on your screen. Part 2 is a recently recorded legal perspectives presentation related to the subject. And Reece Harding is the facilitator, and followed by a commentary from Mayor Karen Elliott and CEO Linda Glenday from the District of Squamish. Part 3 will be a breakout session, an interactive small group discussion where you actually leave the platform and go into a Zoom meeting. There will be pop-up instructions on your screen to do so. And finally, Part 4 will be a Q&A session facilitated by CEO Linda Glenday. We're going to go into the live poll, so over to Reece Harding of Young Anderson.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks very much, Gabby. It's a pleasure to see everybody. Before we get started with the presentation and the discussion that was pre-recorded some time ago, we wanted to take a couple of minutes to kind of set the table and take a poll from people, so hopefully everybody can participate in this. We're going to ask you specifically to focus your mind in on the year 2020. Let's not sort of just globalize this, but let's think about the year 2020. And if you could, think about this question. Did your council or board in the year 2020 A, work better than usual? Did it work about the same as the previous years, or has sort of the stress of the year 2020 really caused problems with elected official and senior management team poor conduct? So again, to repeat that, for 2020, did your council or board work better than usual, about the same, or was it worse in essence? You're going to see, as Gabby mentioned, a little pull-down button at the top right of your screen. If you could start populating that and press on those things now, we'll start to see some of the results as we get. There's a slight delay, so we'll take those results as we get them. Let's give it a few seconds to answer, and then we'll switch over into the pre-recorded presentations. Yeah, so it's looking like the results so far, we're seeing status quo is the majority for 2020. Significant percentage of working better. It looks like number 2 in the poll is 2020 was a stressful year. We'll give it another couple seconds to just completely populate before I turn it back to Gabby to go into the recording. Looks good, everybody. It's helpful for us to know this when we get into the discussion section, parts 3 and 4 at the end of, closer to the end of today's presentations. This information is helpful for Karen and Linda and myself. That's looking good, Gabby. I don't know how much longer you want to give it. I'm happy with that if you want to move forward to the recording. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. We've got a very important and very interesting discussion lined up for you this afternoon. I'm going to take about 13, 14 minutes to set up the discussion, and then I'm going to turn it over to Karen and Linda. Their discussion is going to be a lot more interesting than mine, but give me a few minutes to just set things up so they can knock it down easily. By way of quick overview, I want to say a few things on the concept of conflict. We talk about the concept a lot, but we never actually really kind of get comfortable with it. So I want to say just a few things about that. That'll be very brief. Second part of the conversation, I want to talk more about prevention tools and mechanisms. And this is going to focus on elected officials' behavior. I'm going to focus on the legal prevention tools. I'll talk a little bit about non-legal, but I'll leave most of the non-legal to Karen and Linda for later. So by way of some opening comments on conflict itself, conflict is clearly a natural outcome of working together in group settings. You can't avoid it if you work in a group setting. And I think we have to reinforce it with ourselves that conflict is not a bad thing. We tend to see the word as pejorative. Conflict, it's got to be bad. Well, in fact, it's not always bad. Conflict itself is going to be inherent in local government situations because we have different political views. We see things differently, and the values that we bring into office are going to be different. We're going to be in conflict just simply because of those things. It's built into what we do in essence. Another way of looking at it is that we need to be comfortable with it. We always seem to run away from conflict or think it's, again, negative, but it's not always. If you can get comfortable with it, it's actually a good thing. Low to moderate levels of conflict actually can result in very functional outcomes and can have really positive effects. And if people think about some of the circumstances, perhaps in your personal or professional life, where you've gone through a conflict and come out the other end, it is often a galvanizing occurrence for groups, not divisive, but galvanizing. It's where we get into really negative conflicts that it can cause this turbulence and hinder cooperation and effectiveness in achieving our objectives, our end objectives. And that's really what we want to try to avoid. And that's what we want to talk about today a little bit more. So let's jump into preventative tools and mechanisms from a legal perspective. And this is not intended to be a complete list, but it's intended to get us thinking. There's going to be other options you'll think of, and maybe that's something we can talk about in the small group sessions when we get there. First thing we should always focus on, not really legal, but it always leads to legal, is training, and more training. So communication training, responsible conduct training, conflict of interest training. We should do it as much as we can, not just when we're elected or not just when the term starts, but ongoing. If we can inject this type of training into elected official discussion throughout the term, it makes a huge difference. Second thing to look at is encouraging bystander interventions. And I think we often see this in respectful workplace policies, but consider expanding its application into the behavior between elected officials and senior management team. You can create a culture of accountability by having things like whistleblower bylaws, for example. And again, I think we see that in respectful workplace, but we don't often see it encouraged and enhanced in the behavior between elected officials. And I guess the question is, why not? Number 3, expanded oaths of office. The required oath, as most of you know, under the regulation is pretty skinny, doesn't say a lot. You can build it out however you want to. There's nothing restricting you from doing that. So you can incorporate responsible conduct concepts. You could even address adherence to your code of conduct if you had one in your oath of office. And I think that's a very valuable thing to be doing to set the stage early in terms. Other things we can look at are procedure bylaw amendments. You can enhance your procedure bylaws, again, by including responsible conduct concepts within it, particularly around meeting protocols. Many of the conflicts that do arise that get a little bit out of hand often come from meetings, both closed and open. And I think the more we build into our procedure bylaws on behavioral expectations at meetings, as well as empowering the chair with conflict resolution mechanisms, the better meetings often can be. So procedure bylaws can be fertile ground for amendments. Other bylaw amendments, some municipalities are exploring opportunities to amend up their remuneration bylaws. So by injecting concepts into their council remuneration bylaws of reducing remuneration for those elected officials who have been found to behave badly over the course of their term. This is something some municipalities are exploring, and that's something to be encouraged if you think that would be fruitful for your communities. Detailed codes of conduct. They're a lot of work. They take a lot of effort to put in place and to draft, but they can be excellent tools with respect to setting expectations in black and white and for people to understand what those expectations are. They also almost always include conflict resolution process, which can be very helpful when you're in the middle of a problem. Having the process built out in advance in black and white can be very helpful. So detailed codes of conduct are an excellent prevention tool and mechanism that can be used. Some municipalities now are choosing to engage their codes of conduct by way of bylaws, not just policies anymore. I don't think there's anything restricting the local government from building it out as a bylaw. But some municipalities are taking it, I guess, more seriously to that extent by putting in bylaw form as opposed to just a policy. Enhanced censure hearings. If you don't know what a censure hearing is, it's really easily described as a council hearing to review another elected official's conduct. So where somebody's gone offside expectations, council convenes in its own group to review the conduct and then mete out some censure or punishment at the end of it. They can be within a code of conduct. They can be set out there. They can be standalone processes, and they've been used in BC for quite some time now, and the courts have authorized these types of hearings. They're not the best in my view if you can avoid them, but they certainly are a tool that can be used particularly at the back end if behavior has gotten out of hand to try and rope somebody in, so to speak. Third-party investigators. This is, again, probably something many of you are familiar with by way of responsible workplace investigations. We often seem to bring third-party investigators in to deal with complaints under collective agreements or grievances. That seems to be a fairly common way of using this process. But again, there's nothing suggesting that elected officials can't be investigated by external third-party investigators as well. And it can often be a fruitful way to bring some objectivity, so to speak, to the process. This can be done in an ad hoc way. That's usually how it's done in British Columbia. It kind of happens when it happens. You bring in an investigator when you need them. Or it can be an appointed situation, such as an ethics commissioner. In BC, the only municipality that has an ethics commissioner at the moment is the City of Surrey. It's a full-time appointed position in Surrey. City of Vancouver announced just as of today, today's date is January the 22nd, that they're going to be appointing a full-time integrity commissioner themselves. That's just hot off the press, actually, for everybody to know. Legislative amendments, I could probably talk about this part all day, but I won't. I'll be very, very brief with respect to it so we can get going on the more interesting discussion. But I think it's fair to say that BC is behind most of the rest of Canada when it comes to legislation dealing with codes of conduct and third-party permanent investigators like ethics commissioners. We simply don't have anything express in our legislation, whereas if you compare us to other provinces, you'll find that they do have express authority for these things, and in some jurisdictions it's actually mandatory. That's certainly not the case in British Columbia at all. Nothing express, nothing mandatory. Municipalities that do this, ethics commissioner and codes of conduct, they're doing it voluntarily. There's nothing forcing us to do it. If you want to see a good recent example of some legislation in this regard, I'll refer you to the Manitoba Regulation 98/2020. I've taken a screenshot just of the table of contents here for you. You can go online and Google in the name of this, and you'll see it. It's a very interesting piece of legislation from Manitoba. Manitoba has codes of conduct requirements and ethics commissioners. City of Winnipeg has a full-time ethics commissioner. But this is a really interesting piece of legislation. It only came into effect in November of 2020, so it's very new. And it covers a whole series of things that sort of the big things that you'd expect legislation like this to cover, such as the need for a code of conduct, what's the procedures that have to be implemented when enforcing it, an annual review to make sure that expectations are being met. It sets out sanctions, sets out some very ingenious sanctions, actually. Don't have time to talk about it, but some of them are very ingenious. It also sets out an internal appeal process, which is really helpful. So this doesn't just stop with a council decision. There's an appeal process set up to a third party who reviews the decision of council to ensure that it was procedurally fair and within jurisdiction. That can be a really helpful thing to bring, again, some objectivity to the process. It's a very interesting piece of legislation. So if you're interested and so inclined, Google it, look it up, and have a look. I think you'll be impressed as well. The last thing I wanted to talk about just briefly, number 10, is ministry oversight. It's not really the BC way, to be honest, for the ministry to oversee local government elected officials. We don't have a history or an ethic of doing that normally in this province, especially with local governments. Do refer, though, to the School Act, to the minister in charge of, whatever ministry it is at the time, Ministry of Education, does have the ability to remove the board in very extreme circumstances. But of course, that power is not replicated as it relates to local government elected officials. So just rhetorically, is it time? Should we look at that? Should there be some ministerial power to remove elected officials at the local government level from office in extreme circumstances, maybe conviction of a very serious criminal offense or something like that. Raises some very tricky issues, both legally, I think, as well as democratically. We don't want to be taking people out of office by the stroke of a ministerial pen, but it's certainly worthy of some discussion, it seems to me. Couple small things to sort of tie up those points. It really should be tied together, these concepts. If you're going to do these things, consider sort of integrating or coordinating tools like oaths and bylaws and policies and codes of conduct into one consistent theme that rings throughout all of the tools that you have. If you're expressing different concepts and different tools, it leads to sort of some chaos theory, I think, with responsible conduct. Yeah, that's not what you want. You want them to coordinate and support one another. And on that last point, in essence, you want to bake in, if I can put it that way, using a silly term, but I think that expresses it nicely for the bakers in the audience. Responsible conduct, bake it into your corporate and council culture. And if you can get there, this is certainly where I hope we can get to one day. And I think the rest of us on this panel probably do too. It's important, though, to take a bit of a coordinated approach. Now, just a few words on the non-legal side before I pass it along. And it's kind of funny coming from a lawyer, but I do think that lawyers still have good ideas on non-legal things as well. We're not restricted from talking about non-legal issues. These non-legal tips, I think, sort of cross the gambit, and we should all be thinking about these things all the time when we're dealing with each other in circumstances which can lead to conflict. So first off, identify the sources of the negative conflict. Where's it coming from? What's causing the problem? Is it ineffective communication? Is it stress? Is it warring egos? Is it a lack of honesty? Is somebody being dishonest in their approach with you? Try to identify that, because it can really help fix it if you can identify it. I know it's an obvious point, but it's a very important point. Early intervention is absolutely key. If you allow the layering of conflict to take place in your organizations, you're going to have a very difficult time getting out from underneath those layers. It's kind of like paint. If you're trying to get down to the wood and you've got 10 layers of paint, it's an awful lot harder to strip the paint than it is to take one layer off. Don't let the layers of paint build on each other if you're trying to get down to the wood to stain it. Do it early. Don't let it layer. The third point is a real key one. Identify ways that you yourself may be contributing to the conflict. We always point the finger at other people first instead of looking in the mirror. A wise person said to me once, there's 3 sides to every story. You often hear it's 2 sides. I don't think that's right. There's 3 sides to every story. There's yours, there's mine, and then there's the truth. All of us play a part in conflict, even if small. We all have to accept that we are part of the problem and also part of the solution. So figure out what you are doing or what you can do better. Using cooperative communication is a huge one. Be honest, be respectful, active listen, be curious. If we do those sorts of things, they're all very difficult concepts, but if we do them, we can often dumb down the conflict almost to a non-existent point. And last, sometimes you have to introduce facilitators. Third parties sometimes just have to come into play. You can't do it yourself, so sometimes you need an objective, unbiased person to come in and help you. And there's nothing wrong with that. We shouldn't think that that's failure or something that isn't appropriate to do. It's necessary on occasion. So those general concepts might help people start to think about where the discussion is going to go now. So one of the items that I haven't mentioned in this list above is the role of leadership in conflict resolution. Very important concept, obviously. So let's move the discussion over to Karen and Linda at this point to get their thoughts on leadership in supporting responsible conduct. So Karen and Linda, I'll turn it over to you.
Really unique year, I think, for elected officials and how to lead in a crisis and how to also maintain the quality of the relationships on boards or councils. And, you know, as soon as this crisis hit, I remembered the words of a mentor who once said to me, you know, in a crisis as a leader, your job is to provide direction, protection, and order. And so I think for me, those 3 words were really helpful. You know, being decisive if our CAO came to me or the EOC and wanted guidance. The protection piece, I think, was really important in terms of making sure my staff knew that I had their back, that I wasn't going to point the finger at anyone, that I would ask my questions privately And then we would speak with one voice to the community always. So I think that piece is really important to give your staff the confidence, because they were making this up as they went along as well. And so, and then order, I think communications lay the groundwork for that. So communicating all the time. Linda and I were meeting daily, one-on-one. We worked in EOC briefings to every agenda with our council. I was doing weekly communiques by video with the community. And I know perhaps some of my counselors are attending this session and might be in the breakout groups, so they can speak to this. But I think, and I can speak later, that's one area where I wish I had figured out earlier about how to communicate with them better and also bring their communication back up to the CAO and the EOC on a more regular basis. I think that was one of our challenges. And I think, for all of us in elected officials, it's been a really great test of our ability to understand, the role of doing as a leader and the role of being a leader, and finding that fine line between the two over the past year. I think whenever I strayed into too much doing, I confused things for our staff and found myself frustrated or frustrated community members. And so I actually think I spent more of this year really in that role of holding the space of leadership, being a good leader to my community, to my council, to my staff, and giving my staff the room they needed to do all the doing on behalf of the community. So Linda, maybe I'll let you reflect on your experience in relation to what I just said.
Thank you, Karen. Certainly as the CAO and EOC director, that doing side, especially in the context of a crisis, is really where most of my time and effort is. And working with you was and council was great, because when we have to focus on the doing, we need council to stay as council in the being and the leadership of the community. And knowing that you and council had the confidence in me and our staff empowered us and enabled us to focus on that doing, because we kept saying building the plane as we were flying it, and to know that we had the confidence and that room to just do and focus on the doing and rely on council to be the community leadership, I think overall worked out really well. There were times, yes, when we stumbled into one another, and we've learned from that, and we'll talk about that later. But overall, the difference in our roles was really apparent and important during the crisis, and having council trust was paramount.
Mayor, anything further on that before we move on to the next concept?
No, I think the one thing is that I was lucky that I have a CAO that stays calm. And I think that was something that I also brought to the table. Both of us have a very calm demeanor. And, we had a wildfire breakout in April as well. So not only were we dealing with the pandemic, but then we were evacuating people from the regional district into our community. And I can only describe the importance of the fact that Linda and I looked at each other and we're like, and here we go, right? Like that. And I think that trust was so important, that it was already there, that we weren't trying to build it from a shaky foundation. And I think, that's an important part of what I hope we can share with the group today, is where that foundation of trust came from.
Yeah, so the health of the ongoing relationship is really key. And it's clear from both of you that the leadership roles you both provided were sort of are pivotal in the success you're having in your community, clearly. But moving away from leadership roles for a minute, can you both comment on tools, kind of specific tools that have been helpful for both of you when you've been faced in your different but similar roles when dealing with challenging conduct?
Yeah,
certainly.
Go ahead, Linda.
Okay, thanks, Karen. I'd like to provide an example to the group that to me has proven very valuable. And I'll go back to when I was first CAO, and that was 5 years ago. So different council. But I had been tasked with creating a culture of innovation. So council really wanted to see our culture shift. And when we had a workshop, that definition that we teased out from all of council was continuous improvement. So innovation in a local government context is continuous improvement. And I realized that the culture at the time that I had inherited was one where council would publicly blame staff in council meetings. And it was an us versus them. And it was the easy way out. If council wasn't, if things weren't being delivered, if priorities weren't being met, staff we used the word shredded. It's not a nice word, but staff would get thrown under the bus in the public. And so there was a culture of fear. And so I, at the time, said, I can deliver on this for you, but only if staff feel safe coming into council chambers and working with council. And so the reason I'm bringing that example up is that, that foundation of trust is so important. And the tool that we used is having a common goal with council. So council and staff agreed, let's create this culture of innovation. Here's what it's going to have to take. And it's the trust and the respect and a productive relationship. And I don't think even at the time that council did it from a place of ill will. I think it was almost just a habit. It was a culture that hadn't yet been called out. And when it was called out, suddenly everyone realized we need to shift this. And that, to me, in terms of that council and the council I'm working with now, was really a pivotal moment. And again, it's that shared goal, and whether it was, the direction to be innovative as an organization. And then, that leads into now we have a strategic plan with council, and it's very clear to staff what council's direction and priorities are. And again, it's that common focus that allows us to work together with council, and but having that foundation of we need to feel safe in council chambers with you to move anything forward, I think is really key in a staff council relationship.
Yeah, and I remember that conversation, and you were a new CAO, so I was elected in 2014, and I distinctly remember just the common sort of pause to take that in, that our role in achieving our goal was to really make sure we didn't perpetuate that culture. And as a new councillor, it was so important for me to hear it right from the get-go. And I think it's important to set the context for the group as well, is that, Linda and I find ourselves this term with a really well-functioning council. And I think, last term we were really challenged by our council. And I think what happened, and we certainly had strong personalities, and I'm no shrinking violet, but I think we were all part of the problem. And I think what it stemmed from is that when bad behavior started to crop up, we all made it the former mayor's responsibility. We sort of relinquished our group responsibility for our behavior at the table and kind of made it her problem, which wasn't fair to her, and didn't provide an avenue for us to address, as Reece said in his comments, looking at yourself and your own contribution to the problem. So when I was elected mayor in 2018, and I sat down with Linda very early in the transition process and said, we have 5 new elected, so there were only 2 of us returning. And so how do we step forward with the intention of creating a great council culture and a great council staff culture? And so, some of the things that I'll share with you now were things that Linda and I considered very carefully. And so we started with the swearing in ceremony, and we made all of our council members sign their code of conduct in front of the judge. And so even though that's not a requirement, symbolically, they were doing that in front of the judge, in front of their community, and committing to that. So that was our first sort of symbolic move. We did the DISC assessment, which is an assessment of people's communication styles. And we did that with all of the senior staff, as well as all council members. And all council members got a report talking about their own preferences and also the preferences of their colleagues, so that they could understand the best way to connect with them and communicate with them. And I still go back to those reports when I find myself wondering if I'm being clear, or if I don't think my message has gotten across in the way that it was intended. So that's been really helpful. We did our strategic plan in the first 90 days, and I know some councils and boards drag them out. For me, that was the first piece of work we needed to do together to find consensus. And as Linda said, it's been driving our work ever since. And I made everyone sign it. So again, like, don't miss these opportunities to symbolically get people to commit. So when you see our strategic plan, it's a published document. It's got everyone's signatures on it. We debrief regularly as a council after meetings, and staff and council can bring meetings to the debrief. I think as a chair or mayor, it's your responsibility to model the behavior. And so I was one of the first to apologize in a debrief for getting a little bit hot under the collar, and apologize to my colleagues for that. And I think that has allowed us to sort of take the pressure out of some of those points. And we always remind people to debate the policy and not the people. And I think I had a one-on-one with each councillor at the beginning, and I try and do that at least twice a year, because we all got elected on different platforms and we may have different ideological beliefs, but if those 6 colleagues of mine don't feel like they're being successful, that's where bad behavior comes from. And it's my job as the mayor to figure out, what are their priorities? How can I help them accomplish that in a way that's aligned with our strategic and operational goals, and help them feel like they have served 4 useful years on council and achieved some of their goals. Maybe not all of them, but certainly some of them. And I also share the responsibility. So our acting mayor chairs committee of the whole. They come to all of my monthly meetings with the RCMP, the Chamber, Tourism Squamish, and some of our meetings with other big partners in the community. So they come to agenda planning. So I really try and open up that sense of responsibility, so that they don't feel like I'm sucking all that up into the mayor's chair. So those are just some of the tools that we're using in Squamish to sort of prevent bad behavior.
Linda, anything further?
Yes, I would just like to say that from a staff perspective, the debriefs that we do with council following the council meetings have been very powerful in terms of the genuine leadership that we feel from council. Staff remember that apology, Karen, and staff also remember times when you've had to call a councillor out for stepping outside of what our code of conduct is, and criticizing a staff member in the public when it wasn't necessarily appropriate, and creating that blaming tone and catching them out on that and talking about it safely in the debrief, so that council member can feel like, you're right, I did do that, and staff see that you've followed up on it. And it's a very safe place to have that debrief, because again, I don't think it's anyone's intent to necessarily hurt the people in the public, but when it happens, you call people out on it, and staff feels safe bringing issues to the debrief, and we really do appreciate it.
Yeah, and just so people are clear, the call out, right, like the naming of the issue is not done in a provocative or way. It's like, here was my experience of the meeting. So we always talk about ourselves, like, here is what, and was that your intention, Councillor so-and-so? Or, did you notice this was the wording that you used, and here's how I think it landed on our staff, and was that your intention? And it gives people the space to reflect, rather than saying, you did this and this is the impact you had. Like, it's more about inquiry and curiosity in the debrief, rather than finger pointing and making someone, because that's the tricky thing about communication, is what's going on in my head and how I hear and how I might say something might be interpreted totally differently than I intended by Linda or another staff person or one of my council colleagues. And so that's what the debrief is for, is to go, that wasn't my intent, but I see that I got you really quite fired up. And so it gives us a chance to diffuse some of those situations before they start to fester.
Yeah.
And just one last word, if I might, is the other part of it too, is that as staff members in a public meeting, it's difficult to engage about that in public and respond quickly. And so again, like behind closed doors in a debrief with council, to be able to say, when council said this is how it landed for me, and what did we miss, and did I make a mistake, or what's the intent? And it's just that safe place to debrief and just say it like it is, in a way that's really respectful, and it's again just builds that trust. Thank you.
You guys built a lot of stuff into that discussion there. Conceptually, like sort of trying to pick out tools that you mentioned. You mentioned sort of two really distinct types of tools that I think it's worth kind of trying to summarize. You've mentioned kind of conceptual tools, trust, accountability. I love the one you mentioned, Karen, around symbolism. Symbolism is a beautiful one that, doesn't really get a lot of play. Honesty, expectations, you captured all of that in your discussion. And then real tools, codes of conduct, strategic plans, debriefing. Another great one you both mentioned, apologies, how powerful an apology can be. So that was just chock-a-block full of great stuff there, you guys. Let's move on, though. I'm sorry, we'll have to move forward to the next area for discussion. So thinking about all these experiences and tools you just mentioned, can I ask you both what you've learned from, what most of us would describe as a difficult 2020? Can you give us some feedback on what you did in 2020 to support responsible conduct?
Yeah, I do. So I guess my mea culpa for this year is that I think sometimes as the mayor or chair, you forget how much information, especially in a crisis, is coming your way. For me, I was getting briefings from our MLA and our MP and the health authority and our EOC director, who is Linda, and community members. So I found it really difficult finding ways to effectively communicate that all to council. And I think I dropped the ball in the early days of figuring out a way to transmit that through to my colleagues in an effective way. And then what that did, I think, is result in a lot of questions. So we had put an EOC briefing on our agendas. And eventually Linda had to come to me and go, oh my gosh, these are taking so much time. And I realized that all the information that I had been holding wasn't getting to my colleagues. And so by the time they got to EOC debrief, they were full of questions. And I don't think so that's where I dropped the ball. And I feel like if I hadn't tried to course correct there, that would have led to that sense of distrust and not feeling like they had the tools to be successful in their roles. So that's certainly a big lesson I took away was monitoring that flow of communication and would do it differently next time.
And being willing to change the way you do it. Linda?
Thank you. Yes, one of the things that we talked about at a staff level often was we could see council struggling, especially in the early days of COVID, and even throughout. Obviously engaging with the community becomes much more difficult during a pandemic, and we were so busy running the municipality and dealing with the pandemic, and then we had a council that was really so keen to do something and was struggling with what that looked like in a pandemic. And in hindsight, I think what I would have done better is, we talked about how can we support council, like how can we leverage council? And we did, do some things in terms of, leveraging council for the communication and engaging with the community, but not underestimating, the need for council to feel successful and how can we help them. And we were so busy dealing with the pandemic, we turned our minds to it, but then never really came up with the ideas. So I think in future, and we're talking about going forward because we're still in it, is creating more of a staff liaison that can link with council. And we've got our communications department specifically turning their minds to virtual engagement with council and really prioritizing that outward engagement and supporting council in that way. And I think that was one area where perhaps as staff, 2020 hindsight, we would have maybe put some more resources to, but that really would be the only thing I would change. And otherwise the communication, I think I really appreciated that Karen was available to me every day, flowing the communication through to her. And then it became obvious that, the communication to all of council is something we need to continue to prioritize and not forget about. Not leave that vacuum. Yeah.
Let me ask you this, you guys. It's kind of wish list time for you both now. You have to create a wish list of of tools that you don't have now that you might want to have or wish you had in place that would help you deal with future difficult responsible conduct challenges. Can I ask you both to comment on tools that you think would be helpful for both of you?
Yeah, I've got a number. Linda, do you want to start?
Karen, you go ahead. You've got a great list, and then I'm going to you.
I first and foremost, I take up our reset. I think we're behind in BC on having in place legislation that mandates a code of conduct and provides an appeals process. And I think there should be, and I think we've asked for this at UBCM. I think there should be a provincial ethics commissioner and someone to help us navigate conflict of interest as well at the provincial level specifically for local government. So I did read the Manitoba Act, and I think it's a great piece of legislation, and have shared that with my colleagues on the Lower Mainland Local Government Association. I think it's important for folks to remember that, codes of conduct are important, and I think maybe sometimes there's a lukewarm response to them because we still have a dominant culture that's primarily male in local government. And I think a culture that is, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. And I think as we're trying to diversify councils, more women, more young electeds, more people of diverse backgrounds, then those folks are asking us to change the way we do business. And I think the codes of conduct have to be there. From my own experiences, from hearing some of my colleagues' horror stories from around the province, you feel very alone when you start to get caught. And there's no place to go right now. And you just basically have to suck it up. And you can't create a code of conduct in the middle of a crisis. And frankly, they have no teeth right now. And so where do you go when that's not working at the local level? And so we need more clarity. I think it's time, if we believe in creating a fair and safe workplace for local government elected officials. I think that legislation needs to be there. I'd love for us to publish anonymous case studies of how councils have managed difficult behavior. So sometimes we think we're alone in this, and the more you sort of scratch the surface, you realize there's quite a few stories out there, both from the staff side, but also from the elected side, and what's working and what's not. And I think I'd love to see better research on mental health of elected officials and what's helping them be resilient in their jobs, and what's taking away from that. I don't think we really see ourselves as a group to study, but I think it would be really interesting. And the experience of women and people of diverse backgrounds on councils. And I think someone should look into that a little bit further, because I think the results would be eye-opening.
Linda, how do you see it from the CAO's perch?
Thank you, Reece. Really, from the staff perspective, I mean, certainly conduct on council, regardless of staff, is a whole, important aspect. How it affects staff is profound. And when conduct is negative or toxic or otherwise dysfunctional, really it is an obstacle for council to get done what they want to accomplish. And for me, in terms of a tool or something that we could use, I really like Karen's idea of research and anonymous case studies, because I think that would really demonstrate that councils that are functional, have positive conflict, ultimately create a place where staff feel safe. And if staff feel safe, then they can get on with the work. They can deliver council's priorities. If there's bad conduct, staff don't feel safe, we're ducking and weaving and just trying to survive, that does not mean that staff are going to be productive and deliver effectively. And then you talk about mental health too, and that's a huge element for staff that I think is underestimated. So I would echo Karen's ideas and keep in mind the case study research side of it. To me is really compelling.
We got another minute or so, Mayor Elliott, if you have anything to add.
I know that I don't like it when the province interferes in my business, but I think there is a way to balance mandatory code of conduct legislation with municipal autonomy, and having an outlet, a place, an ethics commissioner for local government that we can turn to. And there are cases out there where it's been the mayor or the chair who's been the bully. And what do you do then? I mean, that just, it just binds decision making and the threats to councillors of losing committees and not being effective. I mean, it's a real barrier. So I think we need that outlet, and I think there's a balance that can be found between our ability to design our code of conducts within some parameters established at a province-wide level. So I don't think we should be afraid of it. I think we should welcome it and work with the province on making it happen.
Yeah, you guys, that's a really great conversation, and so much experience and wisdom shines through in what you've both been able to communicate. Thank you very much. It's clear you're doing a smashing job in Squamish, and hopefully you can bring some of that experience to the people who are engaged in this conversation with us. We're going to have to end this conversation at this point, unfortunately, and move back toward getting into our small group sessions, which I believe, Mayor Elliott, you're going to lead. So I'm going to pass that back to you, and I think we're done. That's a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.